Hello, welcome to Loremaster's Library, the show where we look towards real-world topics to help inspire game masters and players at the table. Should take more breath before saying that. I am your Loremaster, and this month we are going through Far East Asia countries and their general histories to help potentially inspire those who want to play or create an Asian-inspired game. This week, we are looking to the favorite of the West, Japan. So, without further delay, let's get started. Japan has shown life upon it since at least 35,000 BC, with the earliest development of pottery being 10,000 BC, this being the era of the Jomon culture. The Jomon were a hunter-gatherer society, but left behind several artifacts such as their famed clay statues, the dogu, as well as several masks. While we have no history of the people, and they do not fit the creation myths of the coming Yamato people, they did develop many creations which would become part of Japanese culture, including lacquerware, the earliest Yumi-style bows, and some of the methods of prayer which would be the beginnings of Shinto faith. Then we had the Yayoi period. Like the Jomon, there is a chance that the Yayoi were not native to the Japanese, but were originally from Korea, the Ryukyu Islands, or a Nui culture. Either way, we also lack writings about them and only know their existence from archaeology. Is what I would say if China did not have records of diplomacy with the people they called the Wu, which detailed deities and religious services which are still continued to this day. They also detailed diplomacy with the nation of Yamatai and its queen Himiko, but what eventually happened to that nation is a mystery. As history begins, we start with the Kofu period, though much is still known mostly through archaeology. The era is named for the keyhole-shaped burial mounds which were commonly used during this time period. But what the era is truly known for is the rise of the Yamato. The various Yamato clans would both unite and expand across the island, establishing a base culture for the country. While I did not start the era as anything more than a confederacy of families, by the end of the Kofu era, they had established rulership over most of southern Japan. While some scholars combine the Kofu era and the following Asaka era into one Yamato era, there is one clear break between the two: the introduction of Buddhism. The new religion had a significant change on the artistry, social makeup, and politics of the country. So much so they changed the country's name. Before, the Japanese people referred to their country as Wa, not to be confused with Wu. Now, they changed the country's name to Nippon. The heads of the clan chieftains were abolished. The country was divided into provinces headed by governors, who were below 3 ministers who directly influenced the throne: the minister of the left, the minister of the right, and the chancellor of the realm. Then came the short-lived Nara era. While more of a continuation of former processes, there were a few large changes, including the change of the capital to Heijo-kyo, today known as Nara, of course because of the Nara era. The city was modeled after the Tang Dynasty's capital of Chang'an, and much of the city was made in imitation of Chinese culture, including fashion and following Buddhism closer to the common Chinese practices. As for literature, the Kojiki was created right before this era began, and the Nihon Shoki I'll have to relook at which one it is. I think it's Nihon Shoki was finished within the first decade of the era. Both books combine Japanese founding myth with records of past eras, and was used to both strengthen Shintoism into an actual religion, as well as legitimize the divine right to rule of the emperor. And an imitation of Chinese poetry was also raised to its heights, and Japan first developed the poetry style of waka. Less than a century after the capital was moved to Nara, it was moved again to Heian-kyo, or modern-day Kyoto. This gave rise to the Heian era. After the strong influence of China over the Nara era, this era marked the decline of Chinese influence and the blossom of Japan working to gain its own independent identity, including its own system of writing. Or two systems of writing, katakana and hiragana. Romaji would come later after communications with it and the West. During this time period, it seems the emperor had full power over the country, but it truly rested in the hands of the Fujiwara family, who had intermarried into the emperor's family. This era was also famed for being the rise of the warrior clans and warrior culture, giving birth to the samurai. Culturally, literacy was only common among the courts, but was important enough that one poem could be enough to make or break one's reputation. The first novel was written during this time, Tales of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu, and various diaries of the courtesans would one day become famous books. Beauty was also important, as they believed, like many cultures, outward attractiveness equaled inner goodness. Not always the case, but people still trust Asimovs. Men would grow faint beards and thin goatees. Women would shave and redraw their eyebrows and blacken their hair, and both would blacken their teeth so they stood out less. The rise of warriors also brought clashes between different clans, and eventually accumulated in the Genpei War, where the Fujiwaras and their puppet emperor were disposed, and the Minamoto clan not only took center stage, but became the first shoguns, taking political power from the now figurehead emperors. This also led to the establishment of two separate courts, one northern and one southern, who would alternate rule of the country while keeping either one group from gaining too much power or a clan from being wiped out. Through this period is also marked by the attempted Mongol invasion of the country before it was successfully turned back. Afterwards, an attempt to restore imperial power, known as the Kenmu Restoration, took place, but was snuffed out after 2 years, which led to a new line of shogun, the Ashikage, to take over, bringing about the Ashikage period. The anti-corruption North and Southern court system fell apart, with the North keeping power thereafter. However, the effects the changeover of shogun caused also brought about the decentralization of power, leading after 100 years to the daimyos of the different provinces to having more overall power, leading to the Warring States period of Japan, which lasted the rest of the Ashikage rule. This era also saw the rise of Zen schools of Buddhism, ink paintings, and Shinto finally becoming an equal religion to Buddhism. The Warring States era eventually led to the Azuchi Momoyama era. This is marked by the end of the Warring States period and the rise of the three unifiers. First, Oda Nobunaga, in his conquest of Japan, ended the Ashikage period during the wars, which is when the official changeover eras occurred. When Nobunaga was assassinated, It was Toyotomi Hideyoshi who would finish the reuniting of Japan, but instead of fully finishing the job, he instead tried to expand by invading Korea. Eventually, after the power struggle after Hideyoshi's death, it was Tokugawa Ieyasu who would gain power and actually focus on creating a solidified central power. With the consolidation of the Tokugawa came the changing to a new era, the Edo period. The first order of business was, of course, to strengthen central authority to the new capital of Edo, which would be future Tokyo, so that they would not need to worry about another dissolution of order. He also was suspicious of outsiders. While he continued to have foreign trade, which was started under Nobunaga, he limited trade to certain parts and certain commodities, eventually passing it to stop Japanese people from leaving the country. He also worked to eliminate the worship of Christianity in the country, worrying about being over-influenced by the West, which resulted in many mass executions and the Shimabara Rebellion. At its height, the capital of Edo had 1 million people, which was likely the largest city in the world at the time. However, between 1720 and 1820, there was a net zero population growth in the country, with many theories why, whether it was unintentional and something holding it back, or it was intentional to keep control. Arts during this time included the Rinpa School of Folding Screens, Soden armor mountings, and ukiyo woodblock paintings. Entertainment included, of course, geishas, music, kabuki theater, banraku theater, poetry, and art exhibits. Because of the increased urbanization, eating out became more popular during this era as well. With the rise of the merchant class and the now leisurely samurai, clothing became more embellished with new methods of weaving, dyeing, and embroidery that was partially brought in by the West. They carried around medicine boxes called inro and small sculptures called nosaku, which were fashionable among men there. And women loved the color red because of how rare the dye was at the time period. However, the era would eventually be driven apart when America, frustrated with the limits of trade, would send ships to blockade the harbor. These black ships made many Japanese realize the outside world was kind of going through an industrial revolution without them. This led to some disagreement between the citizens: open borders or closed, traditional or industrial, and the age-old question from the past 1,000 years, loyalty to the emperor or the shogun. These questions created an era of unrest known as the Bakumatsu Era. Eventually, through negotiations set up by a man named Sakamoto Ryoma, the former emperor abdicated, and a new one was put in his place, marking the official beginning of the Meiji Era. There was some more traditionalists and samurai who kept up rebellion, but this point marked Japan finding a new path forward, especially with we'll call it a Bill of Rights, known as the 5 Charter Oaths, which were put into place. This was the beginning of Japan breaking from its isolation and moving towards being a great country, we call it, like those of the West. So it began to establish an empire which would continue on through the next few eras. This also included rapid modernization of both technology and military. Kimonos began using more Western techniques and dyes, and some promoted the abandonment of Eastern dress altogether, for instead exchanging it for more Western styles of clothing. Japan also became a large exporter of art, made with enamels, lacquerware, metalwork, porcelain, ivory, and textiles. Japan would make a few more larger turns during the 20th century, but I believe we can leave it here. So like last time, let's sum up everything by era at a time. Japan has been inhabited long before historical records, with a few major eras known mostly by archaeology, even around the time its neighbors were uniting in their own countries. There was also speculation that these civilizations were not of the people native to the island, but who may have migrated from one of the neighboring areas. The only real historical records of this era are written by their more powerful neighbors, speaking of diplomacy with a kingdom which eventually disappeared without clear record why. At the time of China, and Europe experiencing their classical eras, the history of Japan just started, with the Yamato clan building up their own power, consolidating the power based on what they imported and experienced from their new neighbors, China. And as they forged their identities, they gave themselves a new name from which they had previously been called, moving capitals as they tried to define the new identity. The Japanese court reached its peak at about the same time that China and Europe began their Middle Ages, changing the capital again to Kyoto, nowadays still referred to as the old capital. They walked away from Chinese influence and built their own. But a warrior class also emerged, which had benefits, but also led eventually to the rise of the shogunate, and the emperor mostly being used as a figurehead for the shogun's rule. The emperor tried to slip the leash once, but the shogun won, at the cost of centuries of the warring states era. An era which was soon brought to an end by the three unifiers. Pre-modern era would see Japan with a new capital in Tokyo, united under one rule. But the two eras before 1912 each took different paths. The first was one of isolation and rule under the authority of the shogun. The other was the reverence of the emperor and doing everything one could to become Western. The difference between the two being a threat from another nation well in industrialization, setting off a battle of ideologies which would eventually end, but would set Japan on a path for a whirlwind of a modern era. Almost makes me regret I'm doing pre-modern only for these videos, but modern you really just need to look into a history book. It seems to be the only thing taught in American schools, recent history. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. So, now that we have taken care of the nations which the West have a passing knowledge about, next week we will be looking at Korea. I've been stumbling all day. Next week we'll be looking at Korea. See you then.